How do we transcend the seemingly insurmountable cruelties of life? The confessional poets Yeats, Murray, and Plath all use poetry as a tool to perceive the body, mind, and society. However, the extent of the poets' enlightenment can be measured by the balance of artifice versus reality within their poetry and how they manipulate these two perspectives to rationalize their perceptions of the world. As we move through this lesson, we'll try to decide whether an emphasis on the figurative or literal is better when trying to raise one's consciousness. For example, although Yeats and Plath seemingly immortalize themselves through excessive symbolism, they are ultimately in denial of their own mortality. On the other hand, Murray is also unable to transcend above the finality of death, despite his lucidity. In Sailing to Byzantium, Yeats establishes the decay of the shell from the very start. So yes, this poem is quite confessional, but I want you to notice that Yeats avoids explicitly mentioning that he is the persona. So no, I'd say this poem isn't introspective at all. Yeats's appropriation of the ottava rima, a 14th century rhyming scheme, is indulgent, but his incessant repetition of gold is almost hypnotic and escapist, exposing this indulgence as an overcompensation for his lack of introspection. There are similarities in Lady Lazarus, where Plath tries to demonstrate lucidity and control about her mortality by structuring her poem in tercets. However, they perform the same indulgent function as Yeats's ottava rima, rendering any self-acknowledgement in the poem passive and incidental. Furthermore, Plath's Germanisms and allusions to Nazism to describe herself as a Jew and her doctors as Herr Doctor are a gross hyperbole, especially when you remember that she was from Boston. Like Yeats, I'd argue that because of Plath's excessive use of these escapist elements, she cannot rationalize her mortality consciously. Notice, however, that in Vertigo, Murray selects modal verbs with a tactile quality to describe being scalp-sewn, knotted, and flagged, which grounds his perception in the senses rather than figurative thoughts like Yeats or Plath. However, we see Murray start to refer to archetypically masculine things like rakes, bricks, and steel pipes in the same indulgent manner as the two other poets, revealing that he is unsuccessfully trying to latch onto concrete representations of himself to make meaning. So, if you use too much symbolism or figurative language, it will blind you from being introspective. But trying to milk meaning out of the concrete is a futile task. Is there a middle ground? Let's look at Yeats and Murray, who use poetry to gain a perceptive insight into their inner turmoils, and compare that to Plath, whose catatonic state of awareness still acts as a constructive mental catharsis. And among schoolchildren, Yeats displays a high degree of metacognition by mentioning a dream and an image floating into the mind. In addition to these direct references to his psyche, the iambic pentameter replicates the cadences of natural speech, proving that this introspection is genuine. After grounding himself, Yeats reaches his epiphany in the final stanza where he contrasts bruise and blear-eyed with blossoming and beauty. By alliterating this plosive B sound, Yeats unites this conflicting denotive diction, demonstrating an internal reconciliation with his own conflicts. This triumph over inner turmoil is also evident in the Corniche, where Murray asserts that I can reach down and feel if I'm depressed. The repetition of the personal pronoun I emphasizes Murray's introspection, which, like Yeats, allows his language to become increasingly indulgent. Here, Murray uses mythical connotative diction, describing a beast made of crystals and elixir as a counterintuitive metaphor for depression. I'd say that, like Yeats, Murray forces this juxtaposition to inject beauty into his own torment, signifying a new enlightened view of his inner turmoil. So, we've seen that indulgence in poetry is only effective with prior introspection, but what about Plath and Tulips? Describing white walls and white caps, this motif of whiteness indicates the sterile and dissociative state of Plath's mind. Nonetheless, Plath's visual imagery is a valid perception of her reality, even if it lacks any mention of the imagination like we've seen previously. Now, class, I want to stress that Plath doesn't exactly reach enlightenment in this poem. Instead, vital tactile and visual imagery is used to describe the walls warming and the warm and salt water. This contrast to the initial sterility proves that Plath's meditative observation of her surroundings allows her to move to the next stage of consciousness. Personally, I prefer Plath's method because it's more tangible and accessible than the egotistical indulgence we see in the other two, even if it's idiosyncratic. Furthermore, poetry doesn't just act to enlighten the poets. Poets themselves can use it to raise the audience's consciousness too. While Murray and Plath successfully utilize allegorical elements to criticize society, Yeats fails to synthesize a coherent argument in his ambitious appropriation of a prayer. In An Absolutely Ordinary Rainbow, Murray accentuates geographical markers like Martin Place and George Street to exert an authoritative control over his own poetry and boost his credibility. In stanzas 3 and 4, it's this increased appeal to ethos that enhances the effectiveness of biblical symbols like pentagram and halo, as well as the harsh fricative and sibilant sounds that help Murray display his contempt for society's lack of compassion. Similarly, the title of Plath's poem The Applicant suggests the setting of a job interview, with this tangibility allowing Plath to seem more relatable, thus increasing the palatability of her argument. Like Murray, Plath exploits her connection with the reader by introducing a persona who orders them to stop crying and open your hand. This harsh accusatory syntax positions the reader to antagonize this persona, who represents wider society. Hence, when the persona asks, "Will you marry it?" the reader is appalled by the objectifying connotations of it, allowing Plath to make a scathing commentary about the societal treatment of women. On the other hand, instead of selecting a concrete scenario through which to push his agenda like Plath and Murray, Yeats falls back on indulgence in A Prayer for My Daughter, relying entirely on symbols such as the tower and horn of plenty to prove his point. Unlike the other poets, Yeats's prayer is entirely within the realms of his own mind, distancing the reader and leaving them with no concrete point of reference. Thus, when Yeats hopes that his daughter be granted beauty and yet not beauty to make a stranger's eye distraught, the philosophical undertones of this statement are lost in the disorienting oxymoron. Again, we see that too much emphasis on the abstract doesn't help anyone, so there is some method that is needed. So, let's summarize. In our analysis of our three poets in the domains of body, mind, and society, we've seen that diving straight into indulgence, whether abstract or concrete, stalls any attempt towards enlightenment. The common denominator in poetry, whether consciousness has been raised, is the initial act of grounding oneself in either introspection or the tangible world. From this launching pad of reality, one can then indulge in poetry and successfully strive for enlightenment. Thanks, class. See you in tomorrow's lesson.